thank you. Welcome, everybody. My name's Valerie Forbes, and I'm the Dean of the College of Science here at Florida Atlantic. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to one of two Frontiers in Science events this semester. Frontiers in Science is where we bring in experts from inside and outside FAU to talk about timely scientific topics and to share our science with the broader public. So in light of our recent launch of our new School of Environmental, Coastal, and Ocean Sustainability, or ECOS, we've chosen environment as the themes for this semester's Frontiers in Science. So that's also wonderful. Before I ask our panelists to introduce themselves, you may have noticed that we're using Slido for the Q&A. You should have received instructions. It's a phone app, and you can type in your questions on your cell phone. You can also like other people's questions, and they'll get voted up to the top. I think we have people going around to offer assistance if you need it. So please feel free to use that. We'll have time, about 15 minutes at the end, for audience questions on Slido. While you do that, could I please remind you to turn off your cell phones so that we don't hear them during the presentation. And finally, I would like to invite all of you to join us for a reception next door after we're finished with the panel discussion. And with that, we have three panelists in person. We have one panelist, Jesse Staletovich, who's joining us virtually this evening, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce us very briefly by just telling us your name, your current position and area of expertise, and one thing about water that you find particularly fascinating. And I'm going to start with you, Jenny, if you don't mind.
So my name is Jenny Staletovich. I am the environment editor at WLRM Public Radio that covers all of South Florida. And I think the last question was just something about water that intrigues me.
Yes, yes.
I guess in covering the environment, the fact that almost everything I have to cover has to do with water.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Todd?
Hi, I'm Todd Crow. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Environment at Florida International University down in Miami. And what intrigues me is water, water everywhere, ne'er a drop to drink. And we'll say more about that later.
Okay, Rachel.
Hi, my name is Rachel Bruton. I'm a research scientist at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, which is one of our northern campuses of FAU. I've worked there for about 7 years. What intrigues me about water kind of builds off of what Jenny said. Every aspect of aquatic environments relates to water. So from microorganisms to sharks, anything we're going to study or anything we're curious about ultimately goes back to what's on the water.
All right, thank you. Jim?
Hey everybody, I'm Jim Sullivan. I am the Executive Director of the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. I'm also on the Governor's Blue-Green Algal Task Force. What intrigues me about water, and I don't know if I would call this intriguing, and this will relate to what we're going to talk about today, is almost every environmental problem that Florida has right now, the vast majority of it, can be traced back to degraded water quality. I mean, it's as simple as that. You look at all these problems, eventually you'll root it back, it will be there.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome. So the first theme that I want to touch on with the panel is drinking water. So we know that water is essential for life. We can go many days without food, but very few without water. We need water for drinking, we need it to grow our food, our ecosystems need water to thrive, and our attractive tropical waters in South Florida are a strong driver for our economy. We only need to look at the long and conflict-filled history of the Everglades to get a sense of the enormous and competing needs for water. At the same time, water's cheap, and what we pay for the water coming out of our taps in no way reflects its true value. So I'll invite everybody to just share your thoughts on this topic as sort of a warm-up question. What are your thoughts on this apparent contradiction, and are there things we ought to be doing differently?
Well, I'll start very simply. So your drinking water comes from right where you're sitting below you, right? It comes from the Biscayne Aquifer. That Biscayne Aquifer, this big lens of fresh water, is recharged through rainwater and also lateral flow from places like the Everglades. The reason we talk so much about the importance of restoring the Everglades is we need to fill up the Everglades with clean, fresh water so that it can push into our drinking water source and push back our rising sea levels, which is salt water. And that's a battle of pressure that we're fighting drastically and desperately. And I think people don't always recognize that connection between the Everglades and the water you depend on.
Follow up with that. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. As Floridians, we see water everywhere. And you think we're a water-rich state. Not a problem. It actually is a problem. Florida is starting to use up its freshwater reserves, and I think right now the EPA or the USGS is estimated by 2030 to 2050, we're going to be seriously draining the aquifers. And if the aquifers are drained, as Todd said, saltwater intrusion is going to happen. You need that downward pressure to keep saltwater out. So as a state, we have to actually really start thinking about conservation efforts. I mean, this is not a joke. We waste, I think the stat is 50% of our water is to water our lawns. That is a luxury we cannot keep on doing. I mean, we do have to protect this resource. It is the most important resource we have as Floridians.
Rachel?
Yeah, I would agree and echo with what everyone else has said so far. You know, we perceive water to be so plentiful in Florida. And I do think, to follow up on what they've said, the education of the public about water shortages in other locations where people are so limited, they only have, you know, a gallon of water to work with a day for all of their daily activities. You know, we can't even fathom that here in Florida, but that could be our future if we don't use our resources more wisely. And so in addition to the research and you know, better usage, I think educating all of us about how important water is and how scarce it will be in our future is really important.
Jenny?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, it may be free coming out of the tap, but I feel like if we don't protect and conserve our water, we actually end up paying a lot more to sort of repair a lot of the damage that we've done. I think we have a lot of examples around the state. The money we're spending on Everglades restoration is a good example of what happens when we don't protect the source. We end up paying later.
Right. So are we proposing that we should, ban or restrict watering our lawns and other non-essential uses like they do in some states?
That is going to happen, and we shouldn't just talk about groundwater. I mean, groundwater is incredibly important, but a lot of our drinking water comes from surface water reservoirs as well. And that's an issue where, okay, they're there and we can drain those just as easily, but they have the other added, problem of our water quality is degrading. West Palm Beach 2 years ago had cylindrospermopsin, a blue-green algal toxin, in the water supply, and that actually got through and had to shut it down. So surface water is a little more susceptible to pollution and other issues, and we have to protect it that way too. It's not just our usage, but it's also we have to keep these waters clean. We're dependent on them.
But we don't have to use drinking water for everything.
No, we don't.
Right? I mean, we use drinking water for stuff that we probably don't have to. And maybe that's something we ought to be thinking about as a society as well.
There's very clearly a perception that we have unlimited water and that we have a huge aquifer under us, and people aren't realizing that it's not recharging at nearly the rate fast enough to keep up. And so as we put in more and more groundwater wells, as South Florida just continues to explode population-wise, we're digging that hole deeper and deeper. And in the meantime, we're not doing enough with the Everglades restoration and stuff like that. But reusing gray water is a no-brainer, and it's safe, and there are plenty of new generation filtration systems that you could use gray water for almost anything safely. And in fact, probably safer than some of the surface water we have because it's coming off of these agricultural lands with all the chemicals and stuff. So something we definitely need to think of.
But people think it's icky.
Yeah.
So how do we change? I mean, because a lot of this is public perception, right? And people think, we got plenty of water, it's not a problem. And so how do we change people's perceptions to value the water and to not think it's icky to use, brown or gray water for things that it's fine.
Well, let's look down the road, okay? Not next week, not next month. I might have worked up with Jenny on this. I wrote an op-ed piece, and the title was, before your feet get wet, you might get thirsty. And my point there was, sea level is not the problem I'm worried about. It's the availability of enough fresh drinking water that I'm worried about. So if you don't think far enough down the road, that's what's going to drive us out of South Florida, not all of the flooding.
Yeah, and I would just, again, we were speaking about this earlier, but as just evidence of this demand on our water systems, because of what happened in West Palm Beach, or one of the contributing factors with the surface water getting toxins in it and potentially polluting the drinking water, they have applied now, I believe, for 32 new wells coming out of the aquifer as a backup to the surface water supply. That's a drain on the aquifer. But this major city needs this, and of course it's a good idea if they have to shut down the primary surface water reservoir. But that's what's going to happen as Florida grows. I mean, what's the stat? There's 1,000 people moving in here a day, something like that, 900 a day? You can only, you can't get water from a stone. So sooner or later, it's going to be a problem.
So Jenny, any thoughts on this from you? I mean, in your role, you have an important part to play in influencing people's perceptions, the public's perceptions on things. Any thoughts you want to add on this?
Well, I have kind of a question, which is, I don't think reclaimed water or gray water is icky at all, but I do wonder about using it close to sensitive waters like Biscayne Bay. If you have a golf course on Key Biscayne, do you want to water it with gray water? And I guess I'd ask that question also leaning towards, like, maybe we should think more about planting our yards with things that don't need a lot of water.
Yes, that's a
that's
good,
a leading question, but maybe you can answer that question about, like, does reclaimed water, do we have to worry about, the nutrients, not the phosphorus, the nitrogen stuff, not what comes from other chemicals in the water.
Excellent, and that is a wonderful segue into our next theme, which is nutrient sources. So excess nutrient input is a problem for both freshwater and marine systems. And in many parts of the world, agricultural runoff is the major contributor. In South Florida, septic systems seem to also be a major source. And Rachel, you've done some work with this, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this and explain why this is such a problem here.
Yeah, so as you said, there's a few sources of nutrients that we really need to think about. There's human wastewater, there's fertilizers, there's atmospheric inputs from fossil fuels, and then there's surface runoff. So there's really the four major things that affect all of our water bodies everywhere. And in Florida, we do have an issue with septic systems for a number of reasons. So the first thing that I want to point out is you always hear about leaking septic systems, and they actually are supposed to leak. So that's part of the design. So they have a retaining system and then a drain field, and the effluent actually percolates out of the drain field, and it's supposed to go through some dry soil, and that's supposed to treat it. Unfortunately, in Florida, we have very high water tables. So our groundwater is really high, a lot of our soil is really wet, and so that treatment often doesn't happen. And so what you end up with is this effluent that hasn't been treated, contaminating our groundwater. And then that groundwater then can contaminate the adjacent surface water. And this is worsened by the tide, by high density developments, by high density waterfront development. So there are a lot of things that we do in Florida that make this issue worse. But there's just a lot of locations where septic systems are not an appropriate choice in Florida. And that's unfortunate, but that's kind of what it comes down to.
So are they talking about removing septic systems in these areas?
So there are certainly some locations that have been identified by many different counties and cities as hotspots where they know septic systems are not working. We did some studies in Lee County where some people couldn't even flush their toilets when the water was high, at high tide. So they knew it wasn't working. And in these areas, we can find chemicals in the surface water like sucralose, which is an artificial sweetener. And so that can be used to demonstrate that there is human waste in the surface water, kind of without a doubt. And so there's a lot of plans to convert these septic systems, hook them up to centralized sewer. With new infrastructure, we can remove up to 90% of the nutrients, all the bacteria, a lot of these ancillary chemicals. And so that's really where we're going to need to go for most places. And that allows us to reclaim that water and then use it for other needs. There are some places where hooking up to wastewater treatment plants is not feasible, and there are standalone systems that don't cost that much more than conventional septic systems that can actually treat the home's waste on site. And we've seen some success with those too. So there's a lot of changes I think we'll see in the future with how we manage human waste in Florida.
And do we know how much, say, percentage-wise, rough estimate, this source contributes compared to, say, agriculture? Or those numbers are maybe a little hard.
I think it's very different by location.
Okay.
You know, in a highly urbanized area like the northern Indian River Lagoon, there's not a lot of agriculture up there, so there's not a huge agricultural influence. But certainly in some other areas near farms or that have canals near farms, you might have a higher influence. So that's right, it's really important to, and a lot of our agencies and local entities do this, you know, assess the scene where you're at, because it's gonna vary so much.
It's incredibly site-specific. Lake Okeechobee is a good example. Obviously, an impaired water body in the state of Florida, one of our largest lake. I think the estimate from DEP is 80% of that pollution runoff that gets into the lake is agricultural. So there's a case where ag runoff is an issue. But then if you go to the St. Lucie estuary or up into the northern part of the Indian River Lagoon, yeah, then it's septic system. So it's totally site specific. You can't just point and say, oh, it's agriculture, or it's septic. I mean, you have to actually do an analysis of what, you know, the environment is like.
And we've employed something called chemical fingerprinting. And so for Biscayne Bay down in Miami-Dade County, when we get these fish kills, these big influxes or flushes of nutrients, 70% of that is from failed septic systems because the groundwater gets saturated, these things leak like they're supposed to, but then that stuff goes straight into the canals and straight into Biscayne Bay. So that's a case where and we have probably 8 or 9 projects going on right now where we're taking all the septic systems out and putting them on sewer. But there's a gorilla in the room here, and it's the gorilla of social justice. So I live in Coral Gables. It costs $12,500 on average to take a house off of a septic system and put it on a sewer system. In Coral Gables, when they tell me that's what we're doing, that's what we're doing. But people who live in Little Haiti or North Miami don't have $12,000 in their bank accounts to hand over to get off a septic and onto sewer. So how are we going to fund this? And some of those neighborhoods are the oldest neighborhoods with the least infrastructure, with the most failed infrastructure, with the fewest resources. So this is a funding problem, and we'll come to this towards the end in terms of what we can do with communities and universities. But there's a social justice part of this that's going to be hard for us to wrap our heads around.
Okay, great. Jenny, did you want to add anything to this?
I mean, I guess I would say to Todd's point, as far as getting the installation done. So I live in Miami too, and I live in Coral Gables too, in the North End, and we actually inquired about getting our septic tank replaced and hooking up to a sewer line. The closest sewer line was 1.5 blocks away, and Miami-Dade County said, you are more than welcome to hook up to that sewer line if you put in the line connecting the 1.5 blocks away, and it was $150,000. That's, you know, a quarter of what our houses were, or more. And so my frustration in sort of covering this is wealthy places like Coral Gables, like Miami Shores, these coastal communities, there doesn't seem to be a lot of outrage to drive putting in those lines, like float float bonds. Like, why aren't these wealthier communities taking this burden on? I know Miami-Dade County is doing things, but local governments can apply for state grants. It doesn't seem like there's as much urgency to get that done. And Todd's right, lower income families, middle income families, I mean, unless the line is right outside your door, it is hugely expensive, and that is a big barrier that needs to be overcome.
Yeah, that's significant. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next theme, which is consequences of nutrients. And I'm going to start with you, Jim. So excess nutrients often lead to algal blooms. Now, researchers have been studying algal blooms for decades, trying to figure out what exactly causes blooms to occur at precise points and places, and what causes some of them to produce toxins. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where we are right now with the science and what pressing questions still need to be resolved.
Okay, do y'all have a few hours?
No, you got 8 minutes.
So I'll try to keep this very short, but yes, this is, it is my background, it's what I study. I'm a harmful algal biologist, essentially. One of the big things right now, we have, as Valerie said, we have spent decades, a lot more than that actually, studying harmful algae and trying to understand them and why some produce toxins, why some bloom in one area, why they don't in other areas. And still, the biggest unknown we have is what triggers these blooms. How do we predict them? How do we know this year is going to be a bad year in Lake Okeechobee? We're going to get a massive bloom that covers the lake that's going to get discharged to the coast. It's going to be a massive problem. We still fundamentally don't know that well enough to make a predictive model that works. I mean, we have a lot of assumptions on what we think it is, you know, and theories on it. But ultimately, we're still grasping at understanding that what you would think would be the most basic thing we should be able to answer. But it's not like that. Biology is incredibly complex. It's very chaotic, understanding what one thing triggers a bloom to happen or not happen. So we struggle with that. We will get there, but it still takes a lot of science. As far as, you know, where we are right now, obviously, as I said, I'm on the Blue-Green Algal Task Force. What we want to do is get to the point that we don't have these massive blooms anymore. We're always going to have harmful algal blooms. They're an organism that shares this earth with us. They're always going to be there. We just don't want them to be in these massive amounts that last for months at a time and really damage the environment. So we need to really stop them at their source and cut off their food supply. What's their food supply? Nitrogen, phosphorus, nutrients. So everything we're talking about, again, it goes back to this degraded water quality. It causes these blooms to occur, but it fuels them. It allows them to grow biomass, just like fertilizing your lawn or fertilizing a crop. Well, we're fertilizing the water, and it makes these algae grow. So we need to cut off that source, or this fire is going to keep on burning. Now, the state is investing a lot of money right now in mitigation. So we're basically becoming firefighters. We're trying to put out a fire that already exists. And that is really not the way we want to go about it. We want to stop having to mitigate these things and just stop them from occurring at all. So this is where you're seeing a lot of new rulemaking from the DEP and FDACs and various agencies in the state, and it's what we deal with on the task force, of trying to put in controls for nutrient pollution around the state, both agricultural, septic to sewer, stormwater treatment and runoff, and, you know, and cleaning up our old infrastructure. And right now, there was just a task force meeting yesterday, very timely. The state is looking at revising our stormwater treatment rules. This is a big deal. I mean, we have you look around Florida, what do you see? Holding ponds, stormwater treatment areas. This is where runoff, storm runoff and other runoff, we're supposed to let biology work at it and start using up those nutrients. A lot of those don't work as well as we thought, or they're old and failing, just like septic systems can fail. So the state is catching up to this and now has proposed for this legislative session a new set of stormwater rules, which will go into effect and hopefully update these treatment areas, put in realistic numbers for how effective they are, and start having to have builders who are developing adhere to these new rules. This is really important, and if you actually can talk to politicians around the state, tell them to support passing this new rulemaking. Nothing is guaranteed that it's going to happen. There are always people, in companies that don't want new rules, because new rules cost what? Money. But DEP has done a very good job of trying to modify these rules and hopefully get it into statute. So if you're interested in politics and what's going on and the control to try to stop this problem, watch what goes on in Tallahassee this session and see it. Hopefully this gets passed.
So as a scientist, I have mixed feelings about asking this follow-up question, but this sounds like a situation where, do we really need more science? We just need to, we know it needs to be done. We just need to do it.
Well, and this is a question you do hear a real lot, and a lot of people are tired when scientists say, give me more money, I need to study this problem more. However, we do. We don't have nearly enough science. It's not that easy of a problem. I just told you, the simplest thing you would think we could do is say, yeah, it's gonna be a bad bloom this year. There's enough nutrients, there's enough light, it's warm enough, they're gonna grow. Guess what? That doesn't always happen. Why didn't they grow? Why wasn't this a bad bloom year? We have theories, and we can kind of, think we know, but we don't definitively know this for many, many algal species. This is just kind of the way it is. So we need more of this mechanistic work. I think with AI techniques and some of the, computer learning we can do, it might actually solve it that way. You start correlating enough things together, you might start getting statistically the answer out that way. So that's a new line of research that people are actually doing right now. Okay. We need that research.
Okay.
And understand, he said an important thing towards the end. It's warm enough. So temperature is another driver of these harmful algal blooms, right? The higher the temperature, the more likely you're going to get these blooms. You all remember what it was like last summer. Down in the Keys, we had surface water that hit almost 100 degrees. Unheard of in our history, right? That's not something we can fix easily. Increasing temperature is not something we can grab onto. So understanding that interaction between increasing temperatures and nutrients leads us scientifically to what we have to do to truly clean up the nutrients to get rid of these or lessen the likelihood of these harmful algal blooms, because temperature increases are here to stay.
Well, no, and I will, man, I've made this point in many lectures. Algae are just like plants. They need three things to grow: light, warm temperatures make them grow fast, and nutrients. We can only control one of those, nutrients.
So let's go to temperature, because that's also something we want to talk about. When we think about water quality, we tend to think of nutrients, toxic chemicals, other things in the water, but certainly temperature is also an aspect of water quality, as you just mentioned. And last year was the hottest on record, with water temperatures in some shallow Florida bays getting to hot tub temperature. This got a lot of press, especially due to the effects it had on coral bleaching. So Jenny, I know you did a lot of articles on the coral bleaching and temperature issue this summer, and I wanted to start with you and ask, how serious is this issue? It's hard to control the temperature, as there's not an end of pipe solution. What can and is being done to address the coral bleaching issue?
Well, so the ocean temperatures that we saw this summer was an ocean heat wave. And this is something that climate change is going to compound and make worse. The last IPCC, UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report warned that there would be, and this was like 2 years ago, warned that there would be more of these ocean heat waves. When this one hit, though, I talked to Ben Kirtman, who's an atmospheric scientist at University of Miami. You guys probably know him. He said no one ever expected that an ocean heat wave would increase temperatures on average by 5 degrees. Like, it was unprecedented, frightening, and left scientists who look at these things very worried that things were escalating faster than they even anticipated. So when you talk about how do we address these things like temperatures, there's the global temperature, there's we've got to stop emissions and try and slow climate or planet warming. And then there's the local issues where I don't know how you control Well, I mean, it's all climate. I'm sorry, I'm not going to try and answer the scientific. You guys answer the science questions, but I will just say that we need to better understand how these kind of unprecedented events could happen, and that goes back to something Jim said about funding. I'm just going to hop around here a little bit. As somebody who's spent a lot of time in scientists' labs, I'm always amazed at the amount of work they get done on the very little money that they have. I feel like I've seen firsthand that science is just chronically underfunded in the state of Florida. Sometimes, and I can say this because I'm not a scientist, but I feel like politicians, you know, scientists tend to bring us the painful truths. So sometimes it's like the less we know, the easier it is. But I would just have people think about that need to fund science and get these answers that are going to get us to where we need to be.
All right, well, thank you. And moving to the rest of the panel, if anybody has any thoughts, I know you all agree we should fund science more, but I'm thinking, you know, the coral bleaching got a lot of press, but I mean, there may be other consequences of that heat wave that you're aware of that maybe didn't get as much public attention this past summer, but are just as serious.
How many people like stone crab claws? Right? So decapods, all of those organisms, and it's mostly the nursery areas where they go to grow, hide from big fish predators. Those are the places that warm the fastest and the most. And so those populations are going to start decreasing because of high mortality associated with little crabs and little lobsters because of high water temperatures. So it's going to have an economic impact. We were talking about earlier, it's going to have an impact on what you can afford to go eat. And so there's, as Jenny said, it was terrifying last year to see what happened so quickly and so much. So we've thrown all the simple projections out the windows and are saying, uh-oh, you know, this could be a lot worse, a lot faster than we thought.
And there's a huge economic cost to this that no one really realizes. It costs the state of Florida and a lot of scientists time and money to go out and try to save these corals. So the Keys Marine Lab and other labs down in the Keys would go out and start to try to take them out and bring them into cooler water and incubators so they could be replanted later. And that's just a mission that takes money, takes time, takes scientists away from what they should be doing to try to save these corals. But then if we lose our coral reefs, we need that barrier. We need it for biodiversity. We need it for potential drug discovery in the future. It's one of the most important things we have to protect us from hurricanes and other events that come in. People don't realize coral is nice to look at and it's great to go swim around in. It's an incredible, important part of our ecosystem, and we cannot afford to let it die and lose it.
Yeah, I think, you know, that event and the warming of our oceans really highlights that all of our problems are multi-stressor problems. So nutrients are a problem, yes. Temperatures are a problem, yes. But they're happening together along with other problems, other pollutants, overfishing in some areas, increased boat traffic. So it becomes very challenging for scientists and for resource managers because there's not one thing that's happening that you can address to fix the problem. So with warming temperatures, the corals may also be stressed because of heavy rainfall making the salinity lower, or because of higher nutrients, or because 100 or 1,000 tourists that day were also on the reef. So it just really highlights the complexity of these issues and how much more we need to really know in order to protect them, I think.
Well, before I get too depressed, we'll move on to the next theme, which is about the importance of green infrastructure in protecting our aquatic resources. So Todd, you've worked with local communities on projects to replant mangroves in an effort to protect coastal habitats against storms and other stressors. You've also been interested in the role that universities have as leaders in sustainability efforts. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this work, why it's so important, and how universities can be leaders in these efforts.
All right, to slow down your depression, I'll start with the second part first.
Okay.
So the Biden administration started a new White House initiative on universities as beacons of hope in light of climate change. And I'm lucky enough to be on the President's Steering Committee for this. And the bottom line is that universities ought to lead by example, right? So all of these communities are being told it's getting hot, it's getting flood, we have this problem, we have that problem, and yet we're still building universities like urban sprawl. We're not building buildings to withstand sea level rise. We're still planting grass. We shouldn't be watering grass. We, as leaders through our academic institutions, really ought to be the beacons of hope and provide partnerships with communities. And so that's what this initiative is all about. We've had a couple of White House meetings, and of course the big thing is how do we drum up funding to retrofit our campuses and to partner with communities and help them build or retrofit county buildings the same way we're going to retrofit university buildings. So that's what this is about. I have a lot of hope for it. Of course, the next election, who knows what happens to these kinds of things. So now let's get specific, the mangroves. So there's enough data out there now to know that if you have a house that's behind a stand of mangroves, an intact stand of mangroves, and we get huge storm surge associated with hurricanes and other storms, you are likely to have 20% less structural and economic damage to your property. That's how good mangroves are. You know how they bend and stuff? That's what they're supposed to do because they absorb the energy from the wind and the water. The problem we have, and so it's tried and true, mangroves grow really slow. They're hard to plant. They're hard to sustain when you're starting from scratch. And so it's like the coral reef problem. When we have to go to an aquaculture kind of approach, take them out of nature, put them back in nature, we're not very good at that. The success rate is really low and it takes a long time. Well, the one thing that drives me absolutely crazy is if I have two people who buy houses and these people cut their mangroves down because they want a clear unobstructed view of the ocean, and these people don't, the insurance companies don't care. They pay the same insurance after they cut their mangroves down as the people who didn't. We know that those guys are going to have more structural damage, more economic damage, and need more insurance money. So until we get our policies and our economic drivers in tune with the idea of green infrastructure, of reestablishing or restoring our natural habitats, our coral reefs, our seagrass beds, our mangrove stands, until that makes economic sense and there are economic initiatives, it's a really big uphill battle. And so that's something we need to think about at the local level because you guys can all change your policies in your little communities about how you do that.
Great, thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to add any thoughts on that? Or?
I mean, Florida is getting better at restoration efforts, which is good. We're putting time and effort into it, and universities are leading it. So it's good, you know. And it's not just mangroves. Seagrass beds are being lost now, especially in the Indian River Lagoon, at massive rates. And part of it's due to degraded water quality, harmful algal blooms, shedding them out, and all that. Coral restoration is being done. It has shown success. We can do this. One of the biggest issues is we're trying to restore something that humans are constantly beating down. It's like nature doesn't ever get a break. So we put all this effort into restoring something, and a year later it's destroyed, just because we're not changing our policies quickly enough to catch up with our restoration efforts. That we've got to let nature will fix itself if we help it. But if we're constantly degrading nature, it's never going to work. So these things have to go hand in hand. You know, it's great that universities are learning this. We have the technology to do it now, but everyone else has to cooperate and give the political will to make these other changes.
All right.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Jenny. Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I have one more thing that might make you slightly hopeful, which is, and it's anecdotal, but when the Army Corps of Engineers first came to Miami with a plan to harden the Back Bay, around Biscayne Bay, against storm surge, and it was a massive plan. They're going up and down the Atlantic coast with these plans, but here in Miami they unveiled this plan, and it was largely hard infrastructure. It was walls, it was pumps, it was gates, And I remember at the time, a lot of people started saying, well, what about, green infrastructure? And I asked the Corps about that, and they said, no, not enough economic analysis has been done on that. Congress requires that we do a cost-benefit analysis, and so there's no way we can use the green infrastructure because we don't know how much money it's going to save. In the course of when they first came and rolled out that plan to now, Miami-Dade County has rejected their offer, said they want to offer their own alternative plan. And I feel like, and this is the hopeful part, that green infrastructure has gained traction. The Army Corps, it's like turning a massive ship. They move very slowly, but they are now going to consider using green infrastructure, and instead of walls, restore mangroves. They've only got a couple little spots down in South Dade, but I feel like when Miami-Dade County finishes their counter proposal to the plan, you'll see a lot more green infrastructure. And I also feel like I may be wrong that could be a good test case, that if it succeeds in Miami-Dade County and protects the billions of dollars in property here, that other places will see how effective it could be. So that, to me, is a little hopeful.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree. All right, Rachel, last word on this topic?
Yeah, so I was going to say, I guess, something similar to try to be hopeful, because a lot of times when we talk about water quality, it can be very depressing. But we do have a lot more technology than we used to have. We do know how to build cities better. We know ways that we can put in stormwater treatment systems in our cities so that things don't just get dumped into the water untreated. So I think, there are glimmers of hope that will allow us to move forward with sustainable, retrofitting our cities to be sustainable, especially as these infrastructure improvements go in the next couple decades, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah. I will just close with, I am very, very hopeful. I mean, you may think, oh God, he's Dr. Doom, he's depressing. But what we really need is people. We need political will. We have the technology, we can do it. We need everyone to get behind and tell the government, do this. Just like Jenny was saying, the Corps of Engineers can be convinced with political will that, no, this is the better way to do it. But that requires cooperation from all of you. You have to help scientists, and you have to help the governments feel, know that this is the way we want to go.
All right, great, thank you. So now I want to go over to audience questions. And I'm pleased to see the technology's working, so I have a list of questions in front of me. So I'm going to read them in order of how they're on my screen here. And this is for whoever feels they have an answer to this. Does the city municipality filter out microplastics, and can a home filtration system filter out microplastics? Anyone who wants to answer?
I don't think so. I mean, generally speaking, if someone knows differently, I think there are places that are looking at that with advanced wastewater treatment, like what it actually does take out, but I don't think that's been the intention. And there are a lot of, that's the great thing about technology. First, we start trying to remove nutrients and bacteria, and then we can remove other things that are ancillary, like microplastics, and then nanoparticles. So hopefully we'll get to where those are the problems, because they're maybe smaller problems.
And
literally.
That question is hard to answer because it's your definition of microplastic. Yes, large plastics obviously get filtered out. Half a water bottle is going to get filtered out. There comes a point, though, these plastics break down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, to the point that I think they can get so small they can cross the blood-brain barrier. You cannot filter those out. I mean, our best filters are 0.2 microns usually for water. Now, if you went to a reverse osmosis where you're basically distilling the water off, yeah, you could get rid of it that way, maybe.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. What is the condition of Florida's aquifers? Clean and healthy, naturally filtered? What can be done to improve them in areas where they are compromised?
Well, I mean, we talked about the big picture, right? So for where we sit, Everglades restoration and getting more clean water into the Everglades is going to help us with the natural filtration of that water moving through our porous limestone and being clean when it gets down into the aquifer. Now, having said that, again, because of the draw, I don't think we worry quite so much about the pollution side of water quality and groundwater, but we do worry about the saltwater side. And so of all the groundwater monitoring wells we have up and down the southeast coast of Florida, every year a couple more of them have a trace of salt water in them. So that means we're losing that battle with sea level rise saltwater and freshwater balances. So I think to keep your eyes on is how much saline or how much salt water is starting to intrude into the groundwater sources.
You know, it's something I don't hear a lot in Florida, but you take a country like Israel, which does not have a lot of fresh water. Desalination is an option to create drinking water, and we have plenty of ocean around us. That's a technology that maybe is worth investing in now if you're in Florida.
Well, at some point, right? It's also expensive.
But I mean, if you have saltwater intrusion, desalination plants can actually deal with that.
Jenny?
No, I was just going to add that there are drinking water well protection rules, and I know in Miami-Dade County there's been a little, it's developing so much that there's that wellfield protection zone constantly. There's pressure to kind of intrude on it, and as residents and citizens, you can do your most to make sure those protection zones stay intact. Things like the urban development boundary down here, keeps development from intruding on wetlands that we need to, to recharge the aquifer and keep it healthy.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll move to the next question. What is the current status of the seagrass growth in areas that have seen loss in the last several years, and how are the manatees doing in response?
I'm trying to think of a hopeful answer. Well, in the Indian River Lagoon near us, where we've done a lot of work, it's definitely still struggling, the seagrass. We've lost a lot of seagrass. There may be places where we've lost so much that it doesn't have the root infrastructure, the seed bank to really come back. And so there are people working on seagrass nurseries throughout the Indian River Lagoon, but we struggle with the fact that the water is still dirty. And so it really has to be done, these restoration efforts in conjunction with water quality improvements to be successful. But there's a lot of work being done to lay the groundwork to better understand how the seeds move through the Indian River Lagoon, how the genetics work, so that when the water is ready, hopefully we'll be ready to help facilitate it. I do think that the manatee die-off event has slowed down. That was what I heard last. So that's a hopeful sign too. And water quality in urban areas is just a constant struggle. So Tampa Bay has been a shining star of restoration and seagrass success and recovery for a long time, but they've really been struggling in the last couple years with the piney point and some harmful algal blooms. So it's just something we're going to have to continue to revisit and try to do better about.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a ton of questions here. I'm going to do my best to go through, especially ones where we haven't already touched on them, and then our panelists will be joining us for the reception afterwards, so I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any questions we don't get to. So here's one that I think would be a good one. Lots of communities in Florida have small lakes where the runoff from the community flows into. What can communities do to help clean their lakes and ponds?
So I was talking about this earlier, that's actually a version of an STA. That's a stormwater treatment area. So it takes runoff. Hopefully it's set up so that water remains in there and biology has time to actually remove the nutrients that are in the water from that runoff. A well-designed STA can work pretty well. It can get rid of 30 to 40% of the nutrients, or it can reduce the nutrients down to about 30 to 40% of the original that went in. There are a lot of programs now. I believe the state is starting funds if it's an old STA, an old treatment area, where your community might be able to get funds to actually redo it and make sure it's working as best it can, just like fixing your septic system and bringing it up to advanced wastewater treatment. So those programs are beginning. We're starting to see a lot more of it. But, as I said earlier, the state is in the process of changing these very rules to govern ponds just like this. So it's important that we get these rules changed so all future developments at least have to adhere to a better standard.
And the question said these are community ponds, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my interpretation is the community wants those ponds to be clean.
So what, I'm going to throw it back on you guys. Be vigilant. They're your ponds. When we had the big fish kill down in Biscayne Bay in 2020, we learned an awful lot about just really simple things. So for example, some of the stormwater drains were completely clogged up and backed up and spewing out plastic and garbage and stuff that were going into these stormwater drains. Nobody told the municipality to come pump those out or clean them. We had some of the rubbish bins that were overflowing, and then when it was raining really hard, that stuff was getting into those ponds. We saw lawn care people taking coconuts, palm husks, and grass clippings and throwing them into those ponds, right? That's all bad. Every single thing I just said is a bad thing. But that's something you can control at your local community level. And we actually created a whole bunch of door hanging tags that say, what can you do to avoid another fish kill like Biscayne Bay? And you say, I'm just a single house around this big Biscayne Bay. But there are 20,000 of your single houses, and you can do a lot.
Yeah, and you know, you bring up lawn, you know, not overusing fertilizer, adhering to local ordinances, don't use it during the rainy season. There are a lot of ways that runoff, if you put too much on your lawn, guess where it's going? It's going into your local pond. That's going to cause algae to grow, it's going to kill fish. So try to be a responsible, environmental conscious person.
Can I add another
Please.
observation?
Please do, yeah.
I just finished a project and spent a lot of time on the water management district stormwater treatment areas. You know, the massive ones, there's like 50,000 acres, 57,000 acres, which I know is way larger than what would be in a neighborhood. But one thing that was obvious to me, and I've been told over the years before I visited them, that they are the best places for bird watching ever. If you have a healthy or well-working stormwater treatment area, the nutrients attract the birds, but it just really, the water clarity, I mean, they, like Jim said, when they work, they really work, and then you get this bonus of wildlife, at least in the big ones. It's really something to see.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, this one's kind of interesting. We often think of land development as being bad for water quality, right? So this question is, how can land development improve or preserve water quality?
By adhering to the new legislation I'm going to say it again, which is basically what it says is they can't, the runoff and the water quality after the build has to be less than or equal to what it was before they touched the land. If we actually adhere to that, in theory, there shouldn't be that much of an effect, unless people are openly polluting and doing whatever they want.
And again, as the technology develops, anything new we build ought to be much better and much more efficient and help avoid those problems. I mean, a big problem with South Florida is it's a kind of an old city, and it's a kind of got old, beat up infrastructure. And we have a lot of retrofitting of our infrastructure to do. So I don't always think it's a bad thing to see new buildings going up if they go up with what you just said in mind.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
Because I just did a story on this today, which is better growth management. You know, if we build in the right places, we're way better off. University of Florida, 1,000 Friends of Florida just did a study on projecting population growth and how much farmland and ag land will be lost over the years. By 2070, we're expected to have 12 million more people. And if we continue to develop the way we are developing now, we'll lose a third of the state's ag land. That's mainly pasture land for ranches. There's something called the Florida Wildlife Corridor that's been underway for a while, but it's only half the land, just over half the land mapped out in the corridor is under some kind of protection. The rest is still unprotected. So again, growth management is a key thing that the state has gotten behind. We used to be a leader in growth management, and then the Department of Community Affairs was disbanded. We did away with growth management laws. Every year, the legislature has made it harder to challenge growth plans and made it easier for development by speeding up comprehensive plan changes.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is a newer one, which I think was maybe triggered by some of your comments. Is turf better for a home property than grass? I have no idea.
Turf is grass.
Yeah.
You're talking artificial turf?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
hardscape, artificial turf, sure. Doesn't require water, doesn't require nutrients. I mean, there are many resources for this, but ways to do hardscape and other things you can do to lessen your environmental impact. I mean, the state has many resources on this, and that's an easy thing to do. It's not easy to do, but you can find the resources to do it if you want to.
Okay, wonderful. So we're getting to the end of our time here. Here's one. What is the Biscayne Bay Task Force, and what are some lessons we can learn from it?
Well, I'm on that. So, it's a group that has all interested parties that enjoy the bay economically, visually, aesthetically, trying to get together and try to figure out how to do the right thing. And so you can go about this in a whole lot of ways. So you can have an umbrella organization that brings you the best science and the best recommendations and puts a little bit of pressure on our policymakers and our resource agencies, DERM and DEP and the South Florida Water Management District, and says, we all know your hearts are in the right place, but there are some things you're just not doing very well. The idea that you only clean out stormwater drains every other year is odd, and it makes zero sense, and we've seen what happens. So the Biscayne Bay Task Force is basically looking at those big picture things that can be done easily, and probably most importantly, we're trying to find ways to generate revenue to do all these things. So when we come up and say we know that neighborhood is putting in a huge amount of nitrogen and phosphorus because of failed infrastructure, how do we get them off of the septic? How do we rebuild their infrastructure with newer technology? Takes money, and everybody doesn't have equal numbers of money. The interesting thing to me, and Colin Polsky's in the audience, and he and I worked on sort of a project, we take a place like Biscayne Bay, and the people who scream the loudest when there's a fish kill are the millionaires and billionaires that live in those high rises because they look at the bay. The people where most of those issues are coming from are 5 miles inland in these little older communities with a median income of $40,000 a year. They don't ever go to the bay. They don't boat. They probably don't fish. They might. They see no connection at all between where they live and what they do and Biscayne Bay. And so an organization like Biscayne Bay, the commission, basically we come into this with our eyes wide open and say community education is the #1 first challenge. We got to get people to understand that just because you live 5 miles from the bay and you don't see it doesn't mean you don't have any impact on it, right? And so that's what that organization, that group of folks is trying to do. And again, a big part of it, at least I'm one of the token scientists on this thing. It's a lot of county commissioners, it's a lot of private industry people and stuff like that. But it's to put pressure on policymakers to do the right thing. Just because our policies have always been like this doesn't mean they're sustainable. And in fact, many of them are not. So that's what we're up to.
All right.
Well, and I'll just also add,
Yes.
sorry.
Go ahead, please, Jenny.
I covered that when the task force was formed, and it came about because things had gotten so bad in Biscayne Bay. The seagrass die-offs, the macroalgae. NOAA at one point finally issued a study that said the bay is at a tipping point. You're going to lose the clear waters that make Biscayne Bay so special. When you get to go out on a flat and see bonefish skimming through the seagrass, that's going to go away. And it took that to form the task force. And I guess as somebody who's covered it a long time, I would say that I hope the task force stays in place forever because we shouldn't have to have a task force. We shouldn't have to be in an emergency to form a task force. And it was things, that when NOAA declared a tipping point, I think everybody sort of was like, okay, we need to do something.
All right, thank you very much. With that, there's lots more questions here, but we're gonna have to end the formal Q&A session at this time. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and perspectives with us. I want to thank my team, especially Brittany Bonner and Zachary Greathouse, for doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work to make all this possible. We have additional College of Science staff and student union staff. Thank you, and a host of volunteers who all contributed to making this evening happen. So thank you all. Thank you, audience, for your participation. We do have a reception next door. I hope you'll join us and you can get your questions answered if you didn't during the Q&A. We will be having a second Frontiers in Science panel on the 22nd of February. Different topic, different group of panelists, but interesting also. And did I forget anything else? I think that's all. So thank you all.